Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the NEC4 webinar series, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. And welcome to those that are new, and if this is the first one you're seeing. I'm John Lake, Chair of the APM Contracts Procurement SIG, and I'm pleased to be hosting today's event. You may have read on the flyer, my background is in technology, which is now widely known as IT, and my contractual procurement knowledge is largely from experience working in many organisations. But I'm just the host today, and the webinar is being given by Dr Jon Broome, who I'll introduce shortly. Just about the Contracts and Procurement SIG Specific Interest Group. The CMP SIG's overall objective is to promote and disseminate knowledge and understanding and best practice of contracts and procurement in a project and programme environment. We do this by providing an ongoing forum for best practice. We draw on and disseminate the experience of others to help project managers. We provide specific guides and publications for contracts and procurement in the project and program environment. We also provide technical support for APM events, which are organised via the branches. And our long-term aspiration is to become an international forum at the leading edge of excellence in contracts and procurement for projects and programs. This is the second webinar in a series of 2. After the webinar, you may well have questions, and there is a way that you can pose these questions to John by visiting the microsite page for the Contracts and Procurement SIG on the APM website, which is on the Communities tab. There'll be a write-up there with the webinar resources, i.e. slides and recording link, plus a link to a survey where you can capture your questions, which you may wish to ask John about the subject. John will answer those by uploading the answers in the same area after he's looked at them. So I'd now like to introduce Dr. Jon Broome. He is someone who has been involved with the NEC series for at least 25 years, and he's also the ex-chair of the CMP SIG. We're still good friends. And so, John, would you like to start?
Okay, thank you, John. So what are we going to do today? Well, the objectives, to recap, were to identify and review the changes made, as well as highlighting changes that have not been made between NEC3 and NEC4, which is published in July this year, to express an opinion. You can disagree with my opinion if you like. It's my opinion on what is good, which is by and large most of the changes. What is bad, which is a bit of an overstatement, really could do better. Things I would like to have seen, words that I go, I could modify that a little bit. And ugly, as in the few clangers that, in my opinion, they have dropped. Part 1 was on the contract strategy changes, and you can read the text in there, and you can go to the webinar, etc. Part 2 focuses on changes to the engineering and construction contract, or the ECC in black, which you'll see there. The ones we're going to focus on, or the main clauses we're going to focus on, are the ones that affect time and money, basically, but also management, I suppose, of change. So payment clauses, the program clauses, the early warning clauses, and the compensation rate clauses, and a little bit on the revised schedule of cost components and the changes they've made to that. As I said last time, part 1 was probably suitable for those who have a basic awareness all the way through to advanced. Part 2, because I'm not starting from scratch, because I haven't got time in an hour, it's really, you've probably got to have some working experience of the document. What I would say, though, is it's not just the engineering construction contract, because it's a family of contracts. There's a lot of similarity throughout the whole family. So many of these changes are replicated in other members of the family. So what I will say is just as relevant there. So what am I going to talk about? 3.5 changes to the payment provisions. You could argue there's 4, but 2 of them are inextricably linked. There's one big change to the accepted program clause. Changes to the early warning clauses. There's quite a few, some good. There's some I'd like to have seen. Changes to the compensation rate clauses. There's 2 new compensation rate definitions. So for those who don't have that sort of basic awareness, compensation rates are claims and variations in old speak. There's lots of positive tweaks in there, and there's one that just isn't. scratching their heads and being confused. And then a quick look at the revised schedule of cost components if time, which let's hope there will be. Context of comments, again, this is a slide from before. There's this quote, which is 2,400 years old, presumably given how old Aristotle is. So it's very easy to criticise what others have done. So put any negative comments in context. What has changed is by and large good, and NEC3 is already a good contract ahead of, in my opinion, the competition in terms of construction-based contracts. So payment for 1.5. So what's changed? Well, if you look at what's changed in payment, they have introduced a new clause 50.2, which shuffles the other ones in 50 down a bit, and it makes it mandatory for the contractor to submit an application before each assessment date with details and in the form stated in the scope. So in the form, in old speak, in the form stated in the works information, which in the 4th edition is now the scope. So that's fair enough. They've done that, but the first issue I have with that is that I know of no contractors who do not submit applications to say this is what I think I'm entitled to. I have heard about it at subcontract level with small subcontractors, but when I say by and large, I've never heard of any main contractor not submitting an application. So, and to do it with sufficient detail to give the project manager who assesses it and goes, is that fair, sufficient detail to understand what they're claiming for that month or that 4 weeks. So you could say, why have you introduced it? But then this is the bit which I suppose object to, should we say. There's new clause 50.4, which says that if they do not submit the application by this date, then the contractor gets the lesser of either the previous month's amount due or the amount due this month. Now that's in my wording, and assuming a monthly payment period. So basically the contractor could have done a month's worth of work, and because instead of getting in at 5 o'clock on Friday, they get it in at 08:30 on Monday, they could just get paid nothing for the previous month's work. And if it's the previous amount is less, so for instance, they've had to pay back some money, then they get the lesser of that amount. Now that, for me, seems a very, very harsh sanction for perhaps being a day late. And when you add in what happens if it isn't in the form stated in the scope, which could be changed because the project manager can change the scope document during the contract, it seems very open to abuse. So the 30th of each month, if it falls on a Friday, it's got to be on red paper, your application, whereas if it's on a Monday, it's got to be in a green one. And, if it's an open book cost, the form stated has got to be, for everything you apply for, you've got to have the order number, the invoice number, that it's been actually gone out of your bank account, etc., etc. And if anything's missing, we're not paying the whole lot, that could be in the form stated. So that in the form stated could be manipulated, shall we say, to be something very, very harsh. So that's why it's in red. That's why, for me, that sanction in particular is an ugly one. I really think that that's a sledgehammer to crack a nut or to crack a problem which didn't exist. So ugly, bad, etc., or worse than bad. Right, payment 2. So these two things I do like. So there's a new final assessment core clause 53, and I emphasise core clause because when we look at payment 3, that's for options C, D, E, and F, the cost base. And this is not needed if the parties are operating the contract as written, as intended, as compensation events are implemented on a rolling basis. So there is a strict timescales for the contractor to notify compensation events, strict timescales for the project manager to say I agree or I don't, strict timescales for the contractor to submit an application, a quotation, and strict timescales for the project manager to get back and say I accept it or have another go or whatever. And if people are doing that, then you should basically have a rolling final account and not have a big argument at the end. And there's many projects where something like that happens. But equally, there are many projects where they don't achieve this. And the new clause creates finality, i.e. the contractor will know what they're getting and the client will know what they are paying. So it brings it the commercial finality at the end of, or beyond the end of the contract. So how does it work? Basically, the project manager makes a final assessment after the defect certificate is issued. So what's the defect certificate? At the end of the, effectively, in JCT terms, the defects liability period, the time for which the contractor has to correct defects in the works. So typically a year, the supervisor issues a defect certificate, which hopefully says there are no defects, or these are the outstanding defects. And if there's retention has been retained, money is taken from retention to correct them. So that's why it comes after the defect certificate. If the PM, project manager, does not do this, the contractor issues their own assessment to the client. So not the project manager, who might actually have disappeared off onto another job and no longer be employed by the client. So they issue it to the client, and there's no time limit on it. Either way, if the other agrees to that final assessment, it is paid within 3 weeks from the time of submittal. And if they don't, they can reach agreement and the amount changed, or they have to start the dispute process within 4 weeks. So from the previous one, there's the senior representative, so you go to someone above, who sits above the contract, who hasn't been involved in the day-to-day, and they hopefully thrash out a commercial solution which both can live with, or failing that, you go on to the adjudication. So that's how it works, and basically I think that's good. It solves an issue which has been, which other contracts have, and which has raised its head on. So next one, payment 3, is a new progressive assessment clause 50.9 in options C to F for defined costs. So stand back a bit. What the hell are these options C to F for those who don't really know the NEC? These are the cost-based options where the contractor, to get paid, has to demonstrate that they have incurred defined costs, so costs as per the schedule of cost components, and they've been incurred on this project, right? Not somewhere else in the business. The complaint from contractors was, we work with a client really well, we work for 3 years, every month their QSs do some audits of what we submit. They can go and look at our books, look at our folders with their invoices, receipts, etc. in it, and they're all happy. There might even have been some independent audits by special auditors brought in on larger projects, etc., and they're all happy. And then we get towards the end of this contract, and on some of these contracts they can be a couple of $100 million, and essentially the client goes, it starts to overrun, and the client goes, blimey, I want to find defined costs in order to reduce the bill that I'm going to pay. So sometimes on a commission basis, as in if you get a percentage of the amount of defined costs you disallowed costs you find, they send in these auditors, and then suddenly the contractor goes, this contract which I thought I was in profit for, now I'm actually in loss. And actually, if it's a big 200 or 300 million pound contract, that actually affects the business quite significantly. So the idea is to stop clients doing that. So how does it work? Well, first of all, the contractor notifies the project manager that a part of defined cost is ready for inspection. So that part could be for a timescale. It could be a subcontractor account. It could be, here's how I've built up my people costs in accordance with that schedule. I think I've done it correctly. Can you audit those, and then we can use those people costs for the rest of the contract? Whatever it is, that part is. Okay. The project manager, or more likely their QSs, or perhaps even their auditors, specialist auditors, have 13 weeks to inspect that part of defined cost. And the response is one of 3 things. It's acceptance, yep, that's fine, or a notification that further records are required, i.e. I need more information, or of errors. So I picked up this error. The contractor, if it's the latter 2, has 4 weeks from the notification to rectify and supply the extra information or the errors. And then the project manager has 4 weeks from question mark to accept or notify us of the correction. I say the question mark because there's a small flaw, shall we say, in the drafting, where it doesn't actually say 4 weeks from what. Is it from the time that the contractor corrects it? Is it from the time that the project manager evaluates it? Or is it from the previous 4 weeks? It's not explicitly stated. It's probably from 4 weeks from the time that the contractor submits the information rectifying the project manager's notification, but it doesn't explicitly say. But putting that aside, overall, 13 weeks could be a bit long in my view, but overall, it's good that that has been put in. I know some contractors who really hurt as a result of that. So, accepted program. Moving on to there. So, bit of background on the accepted program. The NEC has a lot more information required. It is required to be submitted on a periodic basis, which is either weekly or monthly, typically. The project manager has reasons for rejecting this program, and there are sanctions on the accepted program. So if the contractor until the contractor submitted the first program, which contains the information, of course, the price of work to date can't be changed. And also, if it's not updated by the contractor or the project manager actually rejects it, the project manager should start assessing compensation rates, and contractors like first bite at compensation rates because they're more generous than project managers when wanting payment. So there's a minor change at the end of clause. So there's two changes I'll highlight here. One's really minor. It's a minor change at the end of clause 31.2, which states all the information that the program is to contain, and it says something like the program issued for acceptance has to be in the form stated in the scope, and that could be a particular software package, for instance. I would say, well, actually, it's unnecessary change. See the fourth bullet point of clause 32.1, which is the one for accepting it, and it says it's got to comply with any requirements of the scope. So it's already there, basically. If the scope had said it's got to be in Microsoft Project, and there are other software packages available, and it wasn't submitted, the project manager already had the reason to not accept it. So why is that there? The one I say could do better there, is it needed? The one I really like, though, is this one. Within the compensation event clauses, there are treated as acceptance clauses. So if the project manager does not respond to a notification of a compensation event or a quotation, the contractor can give a reminder notification, and then if the project manager still doesn't respond, the notification or quotation are treated as accepted after a further 2 weeks from that. And when the third edition was updated, people said, oh, one of the big problems we have is project managers just not responding to this program which is submitted for acceptance. And it was seen as an oversight. Well, actually, they corrected that oversight in the fourth edition, sorry. So there's a new paragraph in clause 32.1 which says if the project manager does not respond within 2 weeks allowed for acceptance, the contractor may notify this. So that the original 2 weeks is still there. That's what was in the third edition, but the contractor may now notify it and say, oi, you haven't notified, you haven't responded. And if the project manager still does not respond within a further 1 week, then that program is treated as accepted. All right? And that puts a sanction on the project manager to basically do his job. And I've underlined the 1 week because unlike the compensation event clauses where it's a 2 week, a further 2 week period, for the program it's 1 week. And I think that's right because they've got 2 weeks to do it in the first place. And if they haven't done it after the reminder notification. So that I really like. I think that is good as an understatement. That's great. Going on to the early warning clauses. So main changes. First of all, so stand back, bit of explanation on early warning. Early warning clauses are a simple contractual mechanism where, in essence, either party tells the other party about potential problems as soon as they become aware of them. So in non-contractual speak, anything which might affect time, cost or quality. And then as a result of that, you can have a risk reduction meeting of varying formality this was the third edition, and then and you have to come away with actions to solve it. So what happens on the best projects, that happens in any case. It's just a contractual obligation to do it. So what's changed in the fourth edition? Well, firstly, clause 16 has been, which was what it was in the third edition, is now clause 15. So it's just been bumped up. The third edition had the risk register, capital R's, defined term, but all the NEC risk register had to contain was the matter which had been notified and the actions which were going to be done. And that confused the hell out of people compared with the risk management profession's idea of what a risk register is. So I always, when I was doing training, I always had to call it the early warning risk register, the early warning risk register, the early warning risk register, to avoid that confusion. Now, yippee, they've changed the name of it to the early warning register, just to clarify it. So that's one of the changes. You could say superficial, but boy, will it avoid lots of confusion. There is now a regular early warning meetings are held at the intervals stated in the contract data. So almost universally, on sites that I'm aware of, people would have a weekly or fortnightly early warning meeting, or risk reduction meeting it was called, which again confused people, to say what's the state of this, have put in place actions, etc., and so on, monitor existing actions. That now the contract reflects that, and I wouldn't even say it's best practice, it was just standard practice. It reflects that by people state what the interval is. There's also a specific statement which encourages subcontractors to attend a risk reduction meeting if it would assist in deciding actions. And at an early warning meeting, actions are reviewed and updated. So it explicitly states that rather than you just generate new actions for existing early warnings, it's also you review and update in the light of an action is not being done or an action being ineffective or whatever. So all those give more explicit and positive direction on how early warnings should be handled. So all of that is good. I like that. If we then go on to some things which I'm not quite so keen on, and it's really things that they haven't done. So there's contractual contradictions. So is it a risk or an issues register? All right. Well, is it a simplified risk register for any matter which could? So clause 15.1 says the project manager and contractor notify each other for any matter which could occur. So if it is occurring, then you shouldn't notify it. So if we have a problem, it's not we potentially have a problem, we have a problem. Strictly speaking, by reading the words, you don't notify it. But then you've got, in the early warning register, it records the way in which the effects of the matter are to be avoided or reduced. Well, the effects implies that it has happened and we're dealing with the effects of it, which would imply it's an issues register now. Now, you could argue this doesn't matter, as if it is happening and it's become a compensation event, then it's dealt with as part of the compensation event process, the change management process of the contract. But then compensation event process is more to do with quantifying the cost and time effect with it. And you can get into arguments about that and focus on that rather than actually dealing with the matter which is happening. That doesn't it? And what if it is occurring and it's not a compensation event and the project manager can help? So the contractor says, I have a problem. It is my liability. It's not a compensation event. Can you help? Could the project manager say, well, it's not something which could happen. It is happening. I'm not interested. Now, you could say, oh, this doesn't matter. And on good sites, it doesn't matter because people help each other out. But I do know of project managers who have sent contractors away with a flea in their ear saying, oh, no, this is happening. You shouldn't be notifying it as an early warning. No, I'm not interested. Okay. And I do know that once you get into the compensation event process, yes, there's a clause in there which says, have a discussion about different ways of assessing it which are practicable, but that's about for forecasts rather than is happening and we need to do something now. So I think that the wording could be improved there. And then there's the other thing in the early warning register is in the early warning register, it records the way in which matters are managed, or whereas in other clauses it talks about actions and decisions. And the terminology of way, actions, or decisions is inconsistent between the 4 or 5 clauses within sub-clauses within clause 15. Now that you could argue is matters less so, because record decisions and actions. For contractual nicety, I'd like the wording to be a bit more consistent. So all this, it could do better. I'd like it to have been addressed. Operational issues. On the best run sites, matters are resolved as the lowest possible level, and that ASAP is on purpose. It's got 2 P's, as soon as practically possible, by the project managers, delegates, or assistants. So the delegates is they're formally delegated. They can actually instruct changes under the contract. An assistant might be, well, I can write out the form. I'm a junior engineer. I can agree it. We can do it, but it's actually got to go via someone who's got the contractual authority. And on the best run sites, matters are resolved as soon as practically possible at the lowest level. And then the regular early warning meeting encourages those actions to be monitored. The way in which the words have been put in the contract, they don't quite say it explicitly, but they almost push people to say, well, actually a really low level meeting out on site or whatever doesn't count as a early warning meeting. And my worry is that it will just encourage people not to address issues at the lowest possible level as soon as possible. The supervisor, the person in charge of the quality or checking, testing, still can't notify under the contract. That seems a bit of an anomaly. The contract says that it is the project manager who records the early warnings and enters them into the register. Well, if using, I like, as I said previously in the previous part 1, the fact that they encourage the use of cloud-based NEC contract administration systems. Well, if you're using one of those, it's actually the system automatically enters an early warning from anybody into the early warning register, not the project manager. And if we build on that, if you're the main contractor and you've got numerous subcontractors who all have to give you early warnings, and you've got to maintain early warnings under those subcontractors, or early warning registers under those subcontracts, and then you've also got to pass them back up to the project manager, it almost postbox them up to the project manager, for the project manager to enter into the main contract early warning register, it becomes very bureaucratic. So I know numerous sites where actually what's been agreed is that the main contractor is the one who maintains the early warning register, partly because they're at the centre of it. They might have early warnings coming from the project manager and the plant, but also particularly under the price-based options, because they actually own most, as in have liability for, as well as possibly the actions, the best place per party to do the actions. They own most of the risks or the issues, so they maintain it, and it's put on a server somewhere, and the project manager, the one dodge I heard was the project manager formally issues it, even though all the work's already been done by the contractor who's collated it, which seems just to be in accordance with the contract. So those things, I feel here I haven't necessarily given the answers, but I think that a bit more thought would have been beneficial. Moving on from that, what about positive opportunities? So this is one thing I'm keen on. On the best run sites I've observed, people are actively seeking out opportunities. And by that I mean there's a preoccupation for when change occurs, or even before change, actually before change occurs, how can we shorten timescales, reduce cost, etc., and so on. So they don't wait until there is a problem to go, right, how the hell do I solve it and recover time. They're looking to recover time before they've lost it, if you like, or recover them, reduce cost before they have to reduce cost. But the clauses within the early warning clauses, it's about increasing the prices. You notify it for anything which could increase the prices, delay completion or a key date, impair the performance of the works in use. So it's all negative stuff that you early warn about. I would like to have seen it modified from increase the prices or delays the completion, just change the prices, change completion or key dates, and add in, instead of impairs the performance of the works in use, impairs or improves the performance in use of the works. Just to give people a bit more of a nod to trying to seek out opportunities in there. In fairness, you could say, hang on, last time, John, you said a good thing was that there's more emphasis on the contractor initiating proposals for whole life costs, for value engineering, so taking out capital cost, and for submitting a proposal for acceleration where the contractual completion date is brought forward. And yes, that is a positive, but they're all a bit formal for proposals. And there are things like the acceleration, for instance, is to bring forward actual completion date. It's not to bring forward when we're actually going to complete it. So I would like more nod for that, for this. So again, it's could be better, and it would be a very simple change to make. So, John, just to break it up, do you have any, as an NEC newbie, yeah. Any observations, questions?
I'm still a little confused about this early warning register. To me, I know about issues registers and I know about risk registers, but I've never. It's something. Is it a risk register or an issues register?
Well, yeah. If we go to the wording of what the early warning register is defined as, and I'll read it out. And it says the early warning register is a register of matters which are listed in the contract data for inclusion and notified by the project manager or the contractor as early warnings. And it includes a description of the matter and the way in which the effects of the matter are to be avoided or reduced, not how do we avoid it in the first place, when it might happen. Yeah, so that's kind of the conclusion. So what you actually often see is reference from contract data, which is contract data part 1, the client, I should say, fills in, contract data part 2, the contractor fills in, is often people are asked for your effectively a traditional risk register. And then once they enter, and let's say that's the first tab on the Excel spreadsheet.
Yep.
And then during the contract, people notify early warnings, and that's much more of an action orientated, and it's much more akin to an issues register, and it's far more effective. But contractually, it's a bit of a, as I alluded to, it's a bit of a muddle, to be honest. You could say, well, we shouldn't be confined by project management literature, and it's got to be an issues or it's got to be a risk register. But actually, as I gave some examples, I do know where project managers send contractors away saying this is happening and rather than might happen, therefore I'm not interested. Yeah, but you can help. Yeah, but it shouldn't be an early warning.
Is it a bit like a near miss in a health and safety?
It could be, and that's often what you see added in as a reason to early warn in contracts as an option Z, additional conditions of contract. You often see a health and safety, particularly in construction, which has got big bits of kit and plant materials not quite flying around the place, but health and safety is pretty darn important, so I can't emphasise that. So I can't give you a definitive answer, I'm afraid, John.
Okay, well, it's certainly been explained what it is.
Right. Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll move on to the compensation events. So compensation events, claims and variations in old speak and in other contracts. The NEC tries to very clearly delineate between is it a compensation event, yes or no, and it has in clause 60.1 all the core compensation events, the trigger points for a compensation event, if you like. Tries to distinguish between is it a compensation event, yes or no, and then the assessment of it in terms of time and cost, giving much clearer process with maximum timescales, and in clause 63, much clearer direction on how a compensation event is assessed, because this is the area which causes most of the disputes. It's the money. So the good highlights in it. In the short forms, they've simplified the compensation event process to that in the equivalent to the NEC 3 professional services short contract, which, seeing as Contracts and Procurement SIG led the drafting of that. I think that's excellent. There's two new compensation events. One is for the cost of non-accepted proposed instructions. So what do I mean by that? The project manager can instruct the contractor to do quotations for proposed instructions. So how much would it cost if I wanted to add this bell and whistle in to the project? And the complaint from the contractor was that, particularly under options A and B, where the cost of preparing compensation events was effectively not allowed, is the project manager could ask us to do this for multiple proposed instructions and we don't get any payment. Well, now if the project manager instructs a quotation for proposed instruction and it doesn't go ahead, the cost of preparing it is a cost. Now, you will still have the question of what was the change in cost, because if you still utilise your dedicated site-based resource and you didn't bring in any extra resource, then what was the change in defined cost? But having it as a compensation potentially limits the project and project manager asking for excessive proposed instruction. The other compensation is one stated in the contract data. So these will be added by the client, which are for the unique circumstances of the project. And that's a good one, explicitly stated. So I like that. You don't have to add in a Z clause or something like that. There is the merging of the project manager's notification of a compensation event and the instruction to submit a quotation. So I think it's seven or eight of the compensation events. The project manager should be the one notifying the contractor that it's a compensation event and instructing a quotation as a result. Under the third edition, well, the first, second, and third editions, there was this clause 13.7 said every notification which this contract requires has to be communicated separately from other communications. So the net result was the project manager had to notify that there was a compensation event as a separate email, and then under a separate email instruct a quotation when essentially it was the same thing. So with just a little bit of tweaking of wording, they've changed that. And that might sound a minor thing, and it is, but there is some case law from Northern Ireland under the professional services contract where the parties got confused all about this and it went all the way up to the court. So it can go all the way, shall we say. And there is now one fee percentage. So previously, on the third edition, there was a direct fee percentage which was applied to changes in defined costs due to compensation events, which the contractor was incurring directly, and then there was the subcontract fee percentage for the changes in subcontract costs, which was applied there. This also affects the payment under option C to F, the cost-based options, because likewise, if the cost contractor was incurring costs directly, then the direct fee percentage would be applied, and if it was being spent on subcontracts, then the subcontract fee percentage would be applied on top of that. That led to all sorts of games at tender, where contractors would say in your costing model, which under EU procurement, you've got to state up front, does that reflect how we're going to incur costs? And there were games within them. Getting rid of two fee percentages basically eliminates those games. So it cuts down on that. So that's good. It's not good for me as a consultant, but it's good for the industry and good for the contract. Good highlights too. Greater clarity on the dividing date, or there has been in the past this debate about, well, okay, when do we assess the changing costs from, in terms of dividing them into a forecast and actual? What bits do we say, well, you've done it already, and then we assess it on historical data, and what bit do we assess on a forecast? Even though by the time you actually submit the quotation, the work will have been done and you might even have records available. And the idea is that as the NEC has progressed and developed, they push towards forecasts, partly because it's good project management. If you can, one of the things which, if you're giving a you want a good quotation from a contractor, you need to give them good information on which to base that. And then you get cheaper quotations because they can plan and work efficiently, right? So they push towards that. There's greater clarity on what the dividing date is. That dividing date is included in clause, or reference to a dividing date is included in the clause for assessing time as well. So it ties the last bullet point, time and cost close together. You should always read a contract in its entirety, but the fact that both clauses now contain reference to the dividing date means that the assessment of time and cost, which naturally sit together, contractually more closely sit together. It's more explicit. I think they did under the third edition. It's just more explicit now. So that's good. There's a new clause 65, which pushes back the old clause to 66, which gives more comprehensive direction on proposed instructions. So 3 sub-clauses within there about how proposed instructions are handled and managed, rather than it just being one clause. So that provides greater clarity on that. I like that. And there's a change to 66.3 where assessment of implemented compensation events. So an implemented compensation event is where either the project manager has accepted the contractor's quotation or basically told the contractor this is what you're getting, is not revised except as stated in these conditions of contract. Previously, it just said, I'm cracking, I forgot what it was. Not revised if a forecast upon which is based is changed. But there were other reasons within the contract why you could say, well, actually, that could change because of a changed decision. It was implied. Or what about if you go to a dispute resolution process and so on? So now it explicitly said, except as stated in these conditions of contract, and those are stated elsewhere in the contract. So that's all this. It's good. Could do better ones. So one of the things I still do teach my contractor clients is that when you're submitting programming application or method information, you don't want it referenced as part of your in NEC4 scope document, because that way you are contractually held to it. You want any information related to method, sequence, how you're going to be doing it within the accepted program document, because that way you can change it. All right. Now, what that meant was, from a client perspective, is that under 60.1, which is the first compensation event, there is an argument where or you can't necessarily hold the contractor to their method if it's in the accepted program. And part of that was because the entry in the contract data part 2, which the contractor filled in, it said the scope provided by the contractor for its design is in, and it's only the design, the final works, not the scope provided by the contractor for how it is to provide the works is in. There's no reference for that. The reference place is the accepted program. So that allows contractors to say, we're going to build it to minimize disruption to your live facility. It's all in the accepted program. Sign the contract. Oh, no, we can change that now. Yeah. So I think that just a little bit of change. You could have just got rid of for its design in those 2 clauses, and you'd have solved the problem. That could do better. Clarification, which is good, in 60.119 of not being able to complete by planned completion versus the date shown on the accepted program. So unless you're an NEC geek like me, you won't know what the hell I'm talking about with that. So let me explain. 60.19, I'm seeing shrugs from here. 60.119 is the force majeure compensation event. So it's if something really major happens, rather than having to terminate the contract because it's impossible to complete it, it's better to have it as a compensation event, because then you can extend the date or change it around. But it doesn't say force majeure, because force majeure is not a legally defined term, although it's bandied around. It says something along the lines, an event happens which stops the contractor completing the works, full stop, or stops the contractor in the third edition completing it by the date shown on the accepted program, and which neither party could foresee and has such a small chance of occurring, etc. The problem was that when it said the date shown on the accepted program, did that mean the date the contractor was planning to complete the works by, or did it mean the contractual completion date? The legal text said it was the contractual completion date. So legal commentaries in the bullets which have come up. The NEC4 as the NEC3 Engineering Construction Short Contract said, the contractual completion date, common sense dictates that as well, because it becomes impossible to achieve completion, plan completion, by the contractual completion date, well, that rather than the date shown in your program. So that means that all the terminal floats being used up, etc., it becomes impossible to perform the contract. Yet, in the engineering construction contract, they've put it down as planned completion. And that just seems to me as a bit odd and inconsistent with the engineering construction short contract as well. So, timescales to following reminder notifications for the project for compensation. So I touched on this before. So if the contractor gives notifies the project manager of a compensation event, the project manager has 1 week to get back. If the project contractor submits a quotation to the project manager for acceptance, the project manager has 2 weeks to get back. If the project manager says, I'm going to make my own assessment of that quota, of that compensation event, they have 3 weeks to do it. As soon as the project manager exceeds those timescales, the contractor can, and this was in NEC3, can basically send in a reminder notification. And if the project manager still doesn't get back within a further 2 weeks, then whichever one of those communications it is treated as accepted. So it's to stop what the panel at the time said was an indolent project manager. I had to look up indolent, it means lazy. I think a kind interpretation is overworked project managers who don't have time. So that's NEC3, it's still NEC4. My could do better is why does the project manager still have 2 weeks when they've got 1 week, 2 weeks, and 3 weeks for the original response? And also for the program, you've checked that the one that they've introduced, the treated as accepted for the program, is 1 week. 2 weeks just seems to be a bit long when they've already exceeded the timescales of the contract. So that's a could do better. Okay. Bad stroke ugly highlights. Still not resolved in the contract whether it is the current accepted program or the current accepted program plus updates, which is used in the assessment of time effects. So a bit of background on this. There is core clause 63.3 in the NEC3, it's moved to a 63.5 in the 4th edition. The argument was always, okay, we have an updated accepted program, hopefully monthly, yeah? When assessing the time effects of a compensation, the explicit wording in the clause refers to the current accepted program. So do we just refer to that accepted program, even though it might be 3 or 4 weeks, or if you're not getting accepted programs, months out of date? Or, and there was other wording which it could be argued implied it, do we say the latest one is the line in sand, but we basically update it to reflect changes, which could be contractor delays, advances, whatever, and then assess the compensation based on the current accepted program plus the updates. Common sense dictates the later, but it wasn't clear. So did they try to resolve this? No. But what they have done since the 4th edition came out in July, in the last 2 weeks, they've published a practice note which says the latter. So the current accepted program plus the updates. But you shouldn't need a practice note on this. It should be explicit in the contract. So that is at best a patch. At worst, well, I'm not sure. At worst, it just creates. Depending on your interpretation of the contract, you could, and some people say this. The contract says one thing, the practice note says another thing. So that's not good. They should have updated it. It was a known problem in the 3rd edition. And they didn't address it. Or did they try and address it? Because this is the really ugly highlight. They've added in a new last sentence to clause 63.5. So this is the 63.5, old clause 63.3, was the real nub clause for assessing delay. The really important, the core clause. You've still got the old wording, but then they added in this clause. When assessing delay, only those operations which the contractor has not completed and which are affected by the compensation event are changed. So let's digest that. First of all, 3 points about it. The words after the and which are affected by the compensation event are unnecessary, because if I read core clause 63.5, the starting bit, it says, a delay to the completion date is assessed for the length of time that due to the compensation event. So it's already said it's got to be due to the compensation event, except this says it rather in slightly different words, which is bad drafting. So let's just ignore that bad drafting and then say, okay, when assessing delay, only those operations which the contractor has not completed are changed. So if a compensation event occurs and the contractor is still doing the operation, has finished doing the operation, then that's not changed. So what's the consequences of this? Well, if I was a contractor, I'd go, blimey, I don't want to complete operation. I want long operations so I can say I have not completed this operation and therefore it can be changed, yeah? So what does that push you to do? It pushes you to do big operations, big long operations. Well, all the literature on programming says program in detail. So it's pushing the contractor the other way from good project management practice. The other thing is, okay, so just as an example of that to bring it alive, I'm a contractor. I plan to do some work outside and plan to take a week, say. Bad weather occurs and it takes and it carries on for an extra week, but that's still my risk. It's still not reached the threshold at which the weather compensation cuts in. It reaches that threshold for adverse weather, the 1 in 10 year figure, and there's another week and a half delay which is effectively a compensation event. But the weather data and weather measurements from the Met Office only come in within the first week after the end of the month. So the contractor waits from notifying to get that, submits that and says, look, it's clearly a compensation event. Project manager goes, yeah, it is, but you've finished the operations, so therefore you're getting nothing. That seems ridiculous. What will be the effect of that is, okay, we've said long operations, but it will also be the contractor notifies anything as soon as they consider it might be a compensation event. So, and you can't blame the contractor for this. You'll get, as a project manager, probably a lot of spurious notifications of compensation events because the contractor's dead scared that they'll complete the operation by the time they've actually sat back and reviewed the information and said, yeah, it is a compensation event. My advice to any client would be just to delete that last sentence. Stand back again from it. There are 2 schedule of cost components. One of the more major changes is that the full schedule of cost components is only used under options C, D, E, and F. So that's both to reimburse them their costs, their defined costs as they're incurring them. So the cost-based options. And that's only used for assessing compensation events. You can't use the shorter schedule or the short schedule by agreement. Likewise, for options A and B, the price-based options, you have a short schedule of cost components, and that is only used for assessing compensation events. You cannot, the full schedule is not part of the conditions of contract. So in the short schedule, I should say, I've crossed out the you've got people rates are now at tendered rates only. In the 3rd edition, they were amounts paid to people, including allowances for pension and what was required under law. So now you have people rates, so you have to get them up front. If for a compensation event you say, actually, we haven't got the right, there's not a rate there, you go, okay, let's agree a rate for them. And if it's not agreed, then it's at equivalent rates. Now, I can see all sorts of arguments over what equivalent rates is. One of the things that the NEC trumpeted was we try and avoid subjective language. It's a bit like saying, and they say there's no fares, there's no opinions of in the contract. Well, this is a bit like saying at fair and reasonable rates, yeah. And there is no recourse to a more detailed schedule for how you build it up, which to me is an oversight. On the one hand, it will push people more explicitly to get rates in at tender. On the other hand, if you can't agree them, I think you're there's going to be more argument. So that is I could do better. What is good is that the subcontractor is moved into both schedule of cost components, which means under both the long form as it always was, but also under the short schedule, the contractor is paid what they pay the subcontractor in accordance with that subcontractor. Before, you had this problem where how the main contractors, even though the main contractor had to pay out the subcontractor in accordance with that subcontract, how the compensation event assessed was in accordance with the rules for the main contractor's costs, and they didn't match up, and that meant the contractor was at risk, basically. Now, fortunately, people exercise a lot of common sense most of the time, but now you have to exercise, which is good. I think the rest of it is all positive. So they've got rid of the percentage for working area overheads in the full schedule of cost components, and they've got rid of the percentage of people overheads in the short schedule of cost components. Essentially, these were round-up percentages so that people didn't have to calculate down to the minutiae of, well, okay, for this compensation and how much toilet roll will be using because you're on the site for an extra week. The problem was that people played games with them, and if you played games with them, or just how you actually incurred costs didn't match how you thought you would incur costs when developing that percentage, you got some silly answers as a result. And sometimes contractors liked the silly answers, and sometimes they didn't. And likewise, sometimes the employer under the third edition liked the silly answers, and sometimes they didn't. So getting rid of them, I think, is good. The pushback on that is, oh, hang on now, for every compensation event, people will have to work out the cost of the toilet roll for an extra day on site, etc. My advice here, which is almost one of the first things that the QSs do when a site is established, is sit down and work out for a given level of site overhead establishment, what's the overhead per day. And therefore, when a compensation event occurs, which puts you back a day, you just say, well, are your resources pretty much the same as what we've built up? Yes. Well, we'll use that. For God's sake, don't do it every single compensation event. Yeah. And in that sense, it will be a little bit more work to do that up front, but on the other hand, it will avoid an awful lot of the games of tender, an awful lot of the kerfuffle, and the arguments around whether that's included in the percentage, no, it isn't, etc., which was the other thing. They've also got rid of markup percentages for off-working area fabrication and off-working area design. So if you're an NEC purist under the third edition, you'd say, what's the cost of employing this designer? Give me that base rate, and then give me a percentage for a design office markup for the space, the IT systems, the HR. And the reality was that nobody gave the base rate and the markup. They just gave an all-in rate. So they just changed it to reflect that. So that's good. And likewise, if an area is being used for fabrication and it's not being exclusively. The other change is only one fee percentage, which again, all this reduces gamesmanship at tender. And providing you just establish that figure up front early on, simplifies contract administration. Avoid a hell of a lot of arguments. So all of this is good. Okay. So finishing that, because this is recorded, we don't have, I can't answer your questions because you haven't heard it yet, but you have now. But do, as a reminder, do put questions, goes the communities tab, CMP microsite, and there'll be a link, a questionnaire, feedback form where you can do questions, and I'll do my best to answer them, and I'll put them. Apart from that, over to you, John.
Yes, thank you very much, John. That was the completion of the 2 webinars that we've been running on this subject. However, as John says, I'm sure there'll be questions that you'd like to cover in a bit more depth. And you now know on the communities tab on the APM website, the microsite page, you'll be able to place your questions, and John will address them. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time in attending. I hope it's been useful. And thank you, John, for your work in putting this together and presenting today. So I'll say cheerio to you all now. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.